Hi, this is Phil at Simply Rhino, and today I'm going to take a look at rendering in KeyShot and Rhino for Mac. KeyShot is best known and highly regarded as being a simple to use photorealistic renderer that is a great solution for product design, furniture, automotive design and engineering. In fact, anything that can be rendered in a studio environment. KeyShot, however, can also be used for sun and sky architectural renders, such as in this example. Here we want to show a proposed design for an information kiosk and put this in an architectural surrounding. So let's take a look at some of the simple steps that we can go through to take a Rhino model into KeyShot. This is the model that we'll render in KeyShot. It contains our information kiosks and some surrounding context. Most of the elements are modeled as solids, although the glazing is a single surface. The figures are commercially available mesh models that ship with texture maps, and it's also worth noting that all of the elements in this file are externally referenced block instances, and so this file is merely a container for a number of linked blocks. If we go to the Rhino menu and we go to Window and Show Blocks panel, then we can see all of the various externally referenced files. As long as these blocks are simple instances, then KeyShot handles these just like regular geometry. I've created a name view for the camera setting I want to reproduce in KeyShot, and as we'll see shortly, this view will have an equivalent in KeyShot. If I now switch to rendered view, we'll see that there are some material textures already applied. Textures and mapping created in Rhino will be retained in KeyShot, although you can, should you wish, change both the material and the mapping once inside of KeyShot. I've installed the KeyShot plugin for Rhino, and unlike the Windows version, there are no toolbars, and so instead you type in commands. So if I start typing key, you'll see that I've got three KeyShot commands here: render, help and export. So I'll select KeyShot 7 render, run that command, and this will open KeyShot and import the data into KeyShot. Once the import into KeyShot is finished, we can see in the Scene tab of the right-hand panel that the layer structure of the Rhino file has been preserved. We'll also see in the camera views that the Render 001 view is also present, and if we select this camera, we'll get a view that is broadly similar to that set in our Rhino file. To fine-tune this view, it's best to use the dolly control rather than the mouse scroll wheel, as the control is more precise, and for the same reason I'm going to use the separate pan and tumble buttons until I get the view as I want it. Now you'll see that with this view that is quite low down, that we get a noticeable amount of distortion of the verticals. Now if we go back to our Rhino file and we go to viewport properties, we'll see that we're using a 2-point perspective for the lens. Now inside of KeyShot, if we switch to the camera tab, you'll see that we can change the lens from perspective to a shift lens. Now this uses a tilt shift style of lens, and we can estimate the vertical shift for the given view, and this will correct the distortion of the verticals. If you subsequently change the view inside of the shift lens setting, then you're going to need to re-estimate the vertical shift for every view change. Another way of setting the view in a large scene is to manipulate the camera directly, and with the appropriate view selected we can open up the geometry view. This is a second simplified viewport, and we can change the view from the active camera to either a perspective or an ortho projection. We can then click on the little triad in the left hand corner here and choose move active camera position. We can then zoom out a little bit and choose whether we translate or rotate the view about a local or a global axis, and then we can pull the view pull the camera around and gradually manipulate the view. You can change views here, so I can go to a right view, I can pull the camera downwards, and in this way I can gradually, as we do in Rhino, manipulate the view and get the correct position that I want. Once we have the view set up, the next thing to do is to create our sun and sky environment. To demonstrate this, I'm going to switch to a simpler file. For a simpler example, I'm going to use the information kiosk on its own to demonstrate how the sun and sky system works inside of KeyShot. So I'm going to push this out to KeyShot using the KeyShot 7 render command and wait for this to open up inside of KeyShot. Now this will open up at the default settings, and I'm going to go to the architectural materials and I'm going to use the interior diffuse material on the whole of the kiosk. And then I'm going to go over to the environment tab here, and I'm going to choose sun and sky from the selection here, and you'll notice that this brings in a procedurally generated sun and sky system, and I can do things, for example, like setting the location for this. So I'm going to choose a location here of London, and I'm going to set the date for August the 9th 2017, and I can also change the time, of course, here as well, and you'll see that as I drag the time slider across, how the sun angle of course changes and the sky gets lighter and darker. Now there's a number of things that I can change here, but before I do that, one of the important things to consider is the north angle. Now in Rhino the convention is that when you look in world top view, the north angle is in the positive y-axis. This is different in KeyShot, and so we need to rotate the HDR about 270 degrees to assume the same north angle as Rhino. The next thing we need to consider is the best lighting mode to use with the sun and sky system, and interior seems to give the best results for this. We get less blocking out of the shadows on the objects, and the interior mode seems to deal with the bright light that's created by the sun better than the basic or the product modes. Switching back to environment, in settings here I can change the height of the horizon, and this is something that you may want to adjust slightly just to get the horizon dipping behind the boundary of your geometry, for example. Going back over here to the HDR editor, there are a number of settings that we can actually change in the sun and sky, and these are very similar to settings in other rendering packages. So for example, increasing the size of the sun will create softer shadows. Now you'll notice here that when we make changes to the HDR, that the HDR suddenly becomes very blocky. This is because we're only generating a preview of the 4K HDR here, and if we want to see the full resolution HDR, we can use this little button here, this little recycle symbol here, to regenerate a new HDR. Now if we just look at the shadows here, and just move this so we can see the shadows, and I come down here, you can see that as I increase the size of the sun, that those shadows start to soften. Now the sky itself, we can make the sky dirtier, or the atmosphere dirtier, by increasing the turbidity. Okay, and you can see the color of the sky changes here as we move the slider towards the right. So less dirt in the atmosphere to the left, more dirt in the atmosphere to the right, and you can set this for personal taste. We can do a couple of other things here as well, blur the sky. But one of the important things we might want to do, particularly if we're working with a sky that's quite clear, is that we might want to reduce the saturation to avoid getting a blue cast in our scene. If you want to reduce the darkness of the ground shadows, you can go into Settings, scroll down to the bottom, and click on the color of the ground shadows here. Now they should really be black, but in some situations you might want to just lighten this color here so the shadows are not as oppressive. When you've made all the changes that you want to the HDR, to the sun settings, make sure that the HDR is regenerated, and then this can be saved out to our library. So I'll choose sun and sky here, set OK, and then once it's in the library here, I can right click and rename, and I can call this London, and I can give it the date and the time. Having created and saved the sun and sky settings, I can now load these into our original file. If we check on the right hand side panel, all of the settings that we set have been retained, including the all-important rotation setting that we use to compensate for the north angle. It's important to rotate in the HDR editor tab here rather than the settings here. If you set the rotation here in the HDRI editor settings, then this will be saved when you save the file. Now I'm just going to change the height here of to bring the horizon down just to the edge of our geometry, and I'm going to go to lighting, and I'm going to switch to interior mode, and immediately you can see an improvement in the lighting. Now it's time to add some materials, and I'm going to start first with the information kiosk. Now I've already created a close-up camera view for this, and I'm going to go to the scene browser, and I'm going to open up the model layers and open up all of the layers that are involved with the information kiosk. Now there are two information kiosks, and the materials are the same on each of them apart from the map that they're displaying. So we're going to need to deal with that one material separately. But first of all, let's take a look at the overall materials on the kiosk. When I created the model in Rhino, the side panels were created as a solid, and the piece of glass that goes over the map screen was created as a surface. Now in KeyShot we have two different types of glass materials. We have solid glass and basic glass. So I'm going to use a basic white glass for the screen that goes over the top of the map. Now rather than dragging onto the material itself, I'm going to just drag straight onto the relevant layer in the scene browser. Okay, and when I add that material, you'll see that we can see, of course, the map underneath that. Now just for the moment, I'm going to turn off the visibility of that glass screen so I don't inadvertently select it when I'm going to change the material for the map. Before I do that, I'm going to go to the solid glass, and I'm going to add the solid glass. I think I'll use a grey solid glass for the side panels. So I'll drop that onto side glass here. Now the solid glass creates the proper refractions, and you can see the dark edges of the glass here. In fact, if we do this with a clear glass, again you'll see, although the glass is clear, we get the darker edges, which is physically correct. Now in terms of the body of the cabinet, I'm going to use a steel for this. So I'm going to choose metal, steel, basic, and use the rough steel. And I'm going to apply this to the column, the roof, and the base. Now I want to look at the information symbol here and the light. For these, I think I'm going to use an emissive material. I could actually use a light for the light itself, but I might find that this gives me too much glare on this back plate, but we'll take a look at that. So for the information logo, I'm going to use an emissive material. So I'm going to go to my light materials here, select emissive and emissive cool, and I'm going to drag this onto the information logo. If I click on this layer, I can then edit this material, and should I wish, I can change the intensity of the emissive material. Now I'm going to try an area light, but probably this is going to be a little bright, and it's going to give me a problem with this reflection here. Of course, I can go into the light itself and I can reduce the power of that illumination, but we still might find there's too much going on with this reflection off the back panel. So I'm going to change this to an emissive material, which will be a little less intense. And again, I can edit that material and just play with this value should I wish. Now for the map material itself, this will be a Rhino material, which if I edit this will come over just as a straightforward plastic material with the texture map applied to it. I want to make this a glowing material, so what I can do is change the material type from plastic to emissive, and I can adjust the intensity of this material. And it might be better to actually put the glass back over the top of it so we can see how this is going to behave. Just a couple of other things to do in the scene here. I have a black infill, which I'm just going to use a black matte paint for. And pretty much now we should have got most of these components created. Now when we selected the material for the TFT panel, you'll see that there were two panels. This panel here, you can see the highlight around this one. So this panel here will be the second kiosk, and again I can just edit the material here and I can change that from a plastic to an emissive material, and the second map screen will glow at the same rate as this screen. So I'll turn on the glass again and then go back to the overall scene. Now it's a case of adding some materials to the architectural elements. So once again I'll go to Scene, I'll expand the model, and I'll open up the context for the architectural elements. So the blades of the brise-soleil, I'm going to make those a aluminium, and let's make them a basic aluminium and use the rough aluminium. For the front rail of that brise-soleil, I want that to be a painted blue color, so I'll go to my paint materials, shiny, and I'll just use gloss blue. I can always adjust this material later on. Okay, and I also want the steel structure to have the same gloss blue, and then I want the top rail to be a gloss yellow, and we have concrete material and a black material. So here in architectural we have a straightforward concrete material which we can drop in, and for black, once again, I'll just use the paint material, the matte black paint. Now for the glass, I'm going to try first of all using an architectural glass, and I'm going to use this energy glass here with a blue tint. Now that looks fairly realistic as a glass, but brings with it an immediate issue. In fact, if I just hide the glass, you'll see that I have neglected to put any interior inside of the building. And of course this means that we're going to be able to see straight through the building. As you can see here, we can see the horizon line through the building. So whilst we're getting some reflection from the sky, and this glass is starting to look a little bit like glass, it is going to be compromised by the fact that we have no interior elements. Now this is where the KeyShot plugin for Rhino becomes useful, because I can switch back to Rhino and create the relevant elements and update the model. I've now created the internal partitions in Rhino in a separate file, and I'm going to insert these partitions into my assembly file. I'm going to go to my edit menu, blocks, and insert block instance. I'm going to choose file and then prompt to load in the interior partitions, and these are going to come in as a block instance, reference to the world origin. I'm going to bring these in as linked blocks with an active layer style. One thing that I need to do here in order to preserve the layer order in KeyShot is on my new layer that I have here, which is the layer on which the interior blocks sat in the original file, I need to right click on here and choose move objects to this layer. This is because the top layer was active when I brought in the block, and this will by default control the visibility of the block. If I move that visibility to this layer, then I'm going to see the correct layer order in KeyShot. Now just so we can see these come in KeyShot, I'm just going to turn off the mirror glass, and I'm going to keep KeyShot open here while we've got Rhino open, and I'm just going to run the KeyShot 7 render command, and this will push the updated geometry to KeyShot. And we'll see now the partition walls have come in, and the correct layer for those has come in also. So I'm just going to give those a matte white material color, and then re-show the glass. We'll now see that as the render starts to regenerate, that the glass starts to look now more realistic. Now we can go into the material for the mirror glass, and maybe we can just increase the index of refraction slightly, just to make the reflections slightly more noticeable. And what we'll see here is that the glass retains some transparency, but it's also reflecting this gradient sky that we see here. Now, one of the things that we could do to add more interest into the scene is to replace the procedurally generated sky with an image, and we can do this by going to the environment tab and choosing a backplate image here from this setting. Now, the backplate image I'm going to use is part of a set of backplates and a matching HDR environment. And let's just bring in the backplate. Okay, so now we have a scene where we have a more interesting background, and yet we still have the light that is created by the physical sun, which gives us a nice, simple, clear lighting solution. Now, the major issue here now is going to be with the glass, is that the glass is actually reflecting the environment, which is the procedural sky, rather than the background image. And if we wanted to make the glass have a reflection that was more in keeping with the backplate image, then we'd need to load in the appropriate HDR. But then, of course, we would lose the lighting from the sun and sky system. So one of the solutions here is to render out two separate passes and compose the two passes in Photoshop. Now, this is actually much easier than it sounds. This scene that we have here is the basis for our render. So here, making sure that we've got the appropriate camera view set here, which is render 001, we can render out the image. So we'll go to render. We choose what format we want to render this out in. I'm going to render this as a Photoshop file. We choose the size of the image, and I want to, at this stage, uncheck the include alpha in brackets transparency setting. This is because for this render I actually want to preserve this backplate image that we see here. I can then hit render and wait for this to render. When we look at the resulting image in Photoshop, you can see that this is nice and sharp. All the textures look good, but we are missing a little bit of interest in this glass. We've got some transparency to it. We can see the internal partitions, and we can see through the side of the building here where the glass wraps around the corner. But because this is reflecting the environment rather than the backplate, the glass looks a little bit plain. So now inside of KeyShot we do a second pass and change the lighting to an HDR lighting. So I'll go into environment, and in HDR editor we'll now use an image, and we'll use the HDR image which is part of the same set of images as this backplate. Again, these are commercially available images, and I'll load this in. Now, of course, my lighting solution is going to change, but now you can see we get some more interesting reflections on the glass, and I can rotate the HDR around until I get the glass reflections where I want them. We might also benefit here from using a slightly different type of glass. So I'll go to my scene tab here, make sure mirror glass is selected, and I'm going to try a solid glass here. Let's use this grey solid glass. Now this is going to give us a slightly more mirror-like reflection and less translucency. And once again, I can edit the material and I can increase the refractive index to make it slightly artificially high, so those reflections really start to pop. And if necessary, I can also go into the image here and I can increase the brightness of the image, or possibly go to environment and increase the brightness of the HDR, again to just strengthen those reflections. Now for everything other than the glass, I'm going to add a completely diffuse black material. So I use from the miscellaneous material, I'll use this matte black. And let's just pick the top level here. And I'm going to edit the material here and just make sure that the color of this is completely black, and you'll see all of this now drops out, and this becomes very easy to create now as a mask. I'll of course need to reapply my glass material, and then I can produce another render pass. This time when I render, I am going to select the include alpha option, and this is going to make the background drop out. So again, we'll press render and then have a look at the result in Photoshop. So this is what the second pass would be like, and it's very easy now to compile the two images together and make a quick selection of this black area to remove that. And then we can compile the two images together. When we do that, we can achieve a result like this. We simply put the second pass over the top of the first pass, and I'll just turn off this layer so you can see what I can do is to play with the opacity of the top layer so that the reflections are not completely full on, and we maintain some of the translucency or transparency of the glass. So in this way we can get a very realistic reflection, still reflects the objects in the scene, as well as having something in common with the background. This is a version of the final image, and although it's pretty simple, hopefully it will give you a start in creating architectural exteriors in KeyShot. I hope you found this video useful, and if so, please like this video. To be kept informed of new videos as they're posted, you can subscribe to this channel. At Simply Rhino, we deliver a series of classroom courses and can deliver bespoke training either on-site or in our own classroom. You can find details of all our upcoming training courses on our website. This has been Phil at Simply Rhino. Thanks again for watching.